Tonight, we're here to talk about communicating our research. And I think, the importance of this topic is really about the fact that as researchers, we have obligations that go beyond just us conducting our research and writing a dissertation. And I wanted to talk about how we go about making an impact with our research. So I've called it communicating our research, stakeholder outreach and research communications. And I've given it a subtitle because usually in the past few years when I've done this topic, I've done it with one of my mentors, Willie Smith, but we don't have his expertise at the moment. But we always talked about stakeholder research. And as I was preparing for today, I also came across the idea of research communications, and I've sort of added a few new concepts and new ideas to tonight's presentation, just to help us think through the issues. The objectives are really quite easygoing for today, to understand the various channels available to us as researchers for the dissemination of knowledge. And also, at the same time, everything about putting knowledge out there is also reaching out to the research community, the broader research community, I should say, for research contributions as well, and how we can get help with our research. We also want to use it to understand our role as a researcher and how and why we need to communicate to others about our research and progress or our completed research. And I think just before I move on from that particular element, our ability to share our research and our ability to have or to create an impact with the research that we're doing is way beyond just us telling people about completed research. It is the work in progress and how we share about our own developments as we're progressing with this, because there are value to that. And it's not just, do your dissertation, maybe extract 2 or 3 journal publications out of our dissertation and call it a day. It's everything along that journey as well. I want us to be able to learn some communication tips and strategies for us as emerging researchers on this journey, to identify, discuss tools for stakeholder interaction, communication, engagement. And I think that's the bigger one of the objectives for tonight. It's the tools, but I want to add to that very quickly. It's not just the tools. It's how we plan on embracing and utilizing the multitude of tools that we have available to our benefit, but also making sure our research gets out there. And I think the first thing to remind, and I know there's a slide in a second that does this too, but it's important for us to realize that the PhD is not always just a dissertation and a viva. It goes way beyond that. And the impact that we can create in the broader community, in broader society from our research goes well beyond us writing a document that 6 people on Earth read, and that's kind of it. So we do have to look at new ways and enhanced ways of engaging for our research. So the product of our PhD is not only our dissertation, and I want to just, as I said, I told you there'd be another slide on this, but I just wanted to emphasize the fact that, look, the dissertation is one thing. That's what gets us through to being called doctor. But the research and what we can do with that, the different stakeholders that we can engage with, that we can share with, that we can lobby with to make change, to effect change in community and society, is also a big part of, or a big product of what we do during the PhD journey. it doesn't get assessed, or at least in 99.9% of cases, it's not going to be assessed. But it is a contribution to more people understanding what our research is about, finding relevance with our research, adapting and changing policy, or adapting and changing practices because of how our research has informed their practice or informed their community. So there's a lot out there that we can actually create, and a lot of impact that we have. When we talk about impact, we often think of impact factor of journals, and or the impact of making, not so much making a name for ourselves in the academic circle, but actually creating something that means real change for other people. And that's the impact that I like to look at. Whatever research you're doing, whatever byproducts of the research you're doing, actually creates a positive impact onto our communities of interest, and can be used by others for the betterment of a particular population or multiple populations. Now, I wanted to start off with stakeholder outreach and research communication, because the two are interrelated, but they're also a little bit different. And I'm going to spend the first half of today's session talking more about stakeholder outreach. And then for the last few slides, I'm going to go deeply into research communication itself. Stakeholder outreach is a two-way process, because it is not only about sharing your updates or sharing your research with others, it is also about engaging with them. It's a two-way process, but that engagement might be for you to get help or guidance or ideas, or it may simply be a purely feedback situation. But stakeholder outreach is something that we do, or we should be looking at doing, throughout our whole doctoral journey. And it's about identifying who has an interest in the work we're doing. And that can relate to both a direct interest or an indirect interest, because something that they're engaging with has a parallel to the themes that we're working on. Research communication goes a little bit deeper in terms of having that strategy to ensure that our research output and our manipulation of how we present, whether it be write-up, whether it be online, whether it be conferences, whatever, how we actually represent our research and get that to the communities in a way that they will understand. And research communication is not just our dissertation, us writing some journal papers, and us going to a few conferences. It's actually about understanding our audiences. And from understanding our audiences, understanding the best way that we can communicate with them so that they can benefit from the work we've done, and they can understand, analyze, interpret how they as a community can use our research to better inform their own practices. So for the first half, I said I'll focus a bit more on stakeholder outreach and some practical advice about how to keep connected to the broader research community. And that's not just researchers, but anybody interested in where we are. And then I'll move into research communication, which is a more strategic approach to that. I did want to talk about at this stage why research communication matters. And I probably should have said, look, why does stakeholder engagement and research communication matter? So perhaps I need to update this slide as well. But I feel it's important for us to think about this. our involvement in sharing our research with others comes down to a number of different things. And it's really these 6 ideas are core or fundamental to this notion. It is about the fact that being open to public scrutiny is central to research quality and research ethics. As academics, and we're all early career academics in that sense, but as academics, we need to be held responsible to actually make sure that we are not only sharing our research, but allowing others to scrutinize what we're doing. And transparency is both an element of ethics that's very important within the academic world, but it's also a practical thing. The more transparent you are with your research, the more open you are and willing to acknowledge feedback, not necessarily embrace, because some of us don't like being criticized, right? But it is still acknowledged feedback, is actually part of building quality within a research framework. So public scrutiny is not random people off the street saying, well, this is crap, but it is about your research being available so that others can come along and say, you know what, this is my thoughts on this, or I want to understand why this was done, or even worse, where did you get the money from? Who's funding your research? All of that gives us quality, and it helps us to meet ethical standards. The record on accessibility to end users is not exemplary. And if you're part of our chat group on WhatsApp, we've had, myself included in the past few days, people asking for help to access certain books or to access certain research papers from journals and so forth. At the end of the day, access to research is not free for a lot of people. And to be honest, access to a lot of research databases is very difficult for most of us. And I think, again, finding alternate ways to share our research helps break down some of the barriers, because where our publishing houses charge lots of money, and we're looking at $30 to access one article, that can, where I live, that will feed me for a week, because that's actually a big amount of money in some societies. So at the end of the day, when we break down where we are able to disseminate our research, we actually bypass some of those problems, and we help make research more accessible. I'm going to go on record and say access to research should be a public right. I think it should be something that everybody gets for free. Publishers won't like that. Some universities won't like that. Doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, we charge, and it makes it difficult, especially for emerging researchers. In order to get research funding, it's often a core requirement. So if you are part of a research grant, chances are you are expected to deliver your research in formats that go beyond what you have with your dissertation. So you might be expected to do a white paper. You might be expected to do a couple of town halls for different organizations or different communities and so forth. So it's often a core requirement. If it's not a core requirement, fantastic. But you should still engage and say, you know what, how can I get my research out there to as many people who are interested in hearing about it as possible? It is integral to impact and value. For us to have an impact with our research, and again, I'm coming back not to the impact factor and that type of meaning of it, but for us to actually make a difference, for us to help effect change within the broader community of interest, we do need to make sure that we're communicating to that community in ways that they understand. Most of us nowadays, we can read an academic publication. We can pick up a journal article. We look at it, it's second nature to us. But that's not applicable to everybody. If you give somebody a research paper to read, they'll look at it too hard, and they'll see it. They'll recognize that, look, the structure doesn't work with their mindset, or the choice of words is too difficult, or something like that. At the end of the day, bringing our research to the communities of interest, putting it in a language level that they understand. That could be vocabulary, that could be sentence structure, that could be language, as in whether it's English, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Russian, actually creates the value. But it could also be whether we take our research out of our formats and create it as visuals. Maybe it's infographics that clearly explain something, whether it is a website that people can, or a blog that people can ask us questions and get some answers on. All of that really helps create that impact to our communities of interest, to our key stakeholders that are important. But it creates value, because the value comes from when other people understand what we're doing and use that to inform their decision making, then we've done well. How it is done really matters to end users, and that kind of links a little bit to that previous one. But at the end of the day, the people who want to know about our research really want to see how you've developed the research, because they may want to replicate things, or they may want to understand key assumptions that you've made and whether that still applies in terms of what they're expressing and what they're looking at. Or it may go a little bit beyond that. They want to make sure that it is certainly something that is very accessible to them, to make it easier. And finally, the techniques and the tools are changing all the time. And let's just give an example of that. So I know a number of academics who have withdrawn themselves from Twitter as of recent times, because of the change in ownership and the change in policy and the change in transparency. Personally, I don't want to get involved in the political issues surrounding Twitter, or whatever its new name is, but recognizing that Twitter was once, especially for the last 5 or 6 years in particular, Twitter was a very powerful academic ally for dissemination of research. Now it is not viewed so well. But the point here is not about whether we keep our Twitter account or not. Excuse me. The point here is, look, what works, channels that we have available to disseminate and share our research and connect with people, to connect with stakeholders who are interested. Those channels are changing. And changes in Twitter have meant other channels are going to emerge, just as some of the channels, i.e. Twitter, are becoming less popular. The technique side is actually how are we doing it? You know, whether it is, are we creating a video blog, short content? Are we doing TikToks, for example? And TikTok for academic purposes is not a bad idea. It is being used. Are we creating blogs? Are we doing research papers? So it's whether we're following the typical academic standard of, you know, what was the only way 20 or so years ago, or way being more innovative in that. So let's move on to engaging stakeholders for research impact, because our focus tonight is, how do we get the research out there? I wanted to just put up a couple of examples, and these are, a couple of years old when I first started this particular session, but it is looking at researchers in communication. And the fact is, a lot of quality academics are very much focused on ensuring that their research gets out there, developing their skills, but going outside of academia. So Professor Wynn's prestigious Science Writing Award is actually focusing on how this academic could bring in their research and share it with the general population in a clear and easy way. We have somebody from the Macquarie Law School in Australia, from Macquarie University, actually winning a residency at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. A lawyer going into a media house to learn how to refine and polish their skills. It's actually pretty impressive. But it's also recognizing that our role as academics, is not just about teaching and writing. It is about that whole thing that the university is the voice of conscience of society. And for us as researchers, and for us as new academics to be able to really play that role, we've got to learn new ways, emerging ways, to be able to make sure we're connecting with everyone and anyone interested in the research that we're doing. Stakeholder engagement is, stakeholder engagement during research is the process of working together with the stakeholders for a common goal. Now, that kind of sounds a little bit like action research, and I don't actually mean it that way, but it is about the fact that as you are conducting research, as you are uncovering and you are learning and all of this, that you're actually part of the broader community of interest. And with that you're working with them. It doesn't mean you have to be in an action-based research or a transformative research framework, but it's simply about there being communication and connection between you as a researcher and the community being researched or peripherally being researched. That's important. Stakeholder engagement is a lot more than communication and dissemination, and that's really my point here. It's also an ongoing dialogue that requires us to be sympathetic, analytical, to have adaptive behavior that shows respect to the audience. And it's simply coming down, we can learn from engagement with interested parties to help us, because maybe as we're working on something, we may be struggling with how to think through an issue, or we may be struggling with the best way to frame something. Having a good dialogue, having a positive relationship with stakeholders will give you a community to turn to for advice to help you solve or resolve, or even just as simple as think through some of those issues. It also allows you as a researcher to develop a deeper understanding of the world that stakeholders operate in and the solutions that fit their needs. Again, I don't put that as an action research or transformative research agenda, but simply saying having a closer connection to stakeholders of interest will actually help inform better practice with your own research. And it will help you think through issues in a more nuanced and probably intelligent way. So I feel it's very, very important. Now, having said this, I put, but hang on, we're only PhD students. Shouldn't we just be writing our dissertation and not thinking a bit beyond that? And this is where, as I said, normally I get to present this with Willie, and he talks about this. So I'm just going to use one of the quotes from him from last year. As a graduate student, you already possess a huge number and range of skills. And why this becomes important is you're already towards the pinnacle of where you need to be in terms of knowledge. So anything that stakeholder engagement processes, research communication requires of you, you already know how to do. You've already got those tools in your tool belt. And it is not difficult to be able to engage. If you can go out and interview 20 people, you can go out and share about your research with a different 20 people, but you can also learn to adjust the way in which you present it. You can change the language or the tonality of how you present it. You can change the vocabulary of how you present it. So you already have these skills, and I think this is important for us to remember. When you're in a doctoral program, it doesn't matter whether you're towards the beginning or closer to the end. You already have very strong communication skills. Yes, they probably need polishing, but most of us continue on that lifelong learning journey and continue to get better day by day anyway. But you already have the skills to be able to engage and to be able to make some difference out in the communities of interest. Now, for us, let's talk about the type of stakeholders that there are for our research. And I've broken it into two different areas. One, the direct and the indirect. And that's probably a really bad way because many of the indirect are actually direct. But the top three have the final say over whether we whether we get to be called doctor or not, whether we graduate, whether we survive the doctoral journey. So, the university, our supervisor or supervisors, plus our examiners are the typical stakeholders that we think about very early on. And they are stakeholders, but I'm going to make a different argument. The university, our supervisors and our examiners, in my opinion, are some of the least important stakeholders there are. Yes, they get the final say on whether or how we progress, but also they're not the ones who take our research, enact change, and create value for communities. Everybody further down in this list, under my dotted line, actually contributes or can benefit in a stronger way from our research. And I feel that's important. So yes, your university, your supervisor, your examiners are important, but I don't feel that they have the primary importance in terms of being stakeholders. So let's move into the real stakeholders that are out there. Our project partners, others that we're working with. This could be people or organizations who are funding us, who have provided scholarship for us, or who are, through whatever mechanism, co-researching with us, maybe for, sharing of data and, comparison and comparative studies and so forth. We need to look at policymakers as being a stakeholder, because if our research has the opportunity to influence policy, to shape local or regional or national government policy, or even organizational policy, they become very invested in what we do. Professionals, those in the community that work with us, those in the community who may have to change policies and procedures because of the research work that we've done, or they may have to change the way in which they approach something. Other academics come into this as well, because they're going to use our work for their classes. They're going to use our work. Hopefully they cite us, but they're going to use our work in their writing. And that's going to have an impact. It might be business leaders. It might be activists, people who are looking to enact social change themselves and are looking for any evidential support that will help them make that happen. And most importantly, it's communities of interest that relate back to what we are researching and how it is going to enhance or improve or change their lives or their lifestyles. Our purpose of engagement. Now, this is where we come back to the fact that, look, we have to engage not only because we've done the research, but at the end of the day, we have a higher purpose than our PhD in terms of engagement for any research that we do. It's about setting priorities and how to perhaps reshape some priorities. It may be about shaping research questions, and that is directly action research or transformative research that I've talked about previously. But we want to engage sometimes because we want to make sure that we've understood the refinements of the challenge that certain communities or certain populations are facing. So we engage with different stakeholders to inform us so that we're making our research not only as refined or polished as possible, but also relevant to their needs. There's no use in doing research that looks interesting that has no community value. Because if the research itself isn't going to be applied or have help people get a stronger understanding, then it's not that important in the first place. We might use engagement in designing or implementing studies. So similar to shaping the research question, but maybe when we've got our research question spot on, our focus is how do we actually better work with our populations of interest and actually design a research program that's going to get us the data we need to solve our research question that's going to have a real impact on that community of interest. It may be in terms of extrapolating studies. So I have something in mind, I'm working with something, but how can I make it bigger than what it currently is? How can I take it to the next level so that I create impact? It can be in terms of funding programs. We engage because we want to find ways to get funding. Some of us are lucky. Some of us will have our universities either paying us a stipend, or perhaps our supervisor, our department already has access to research grants and other funding. Sometimes we've got to go out there and we've got to look for money ourselves. Now, that could be us trying to get a scholarship. And I know I'll give an example. When I first started my postgraduate journey, I was one of 2 people in New Zealand that year who got a research scholarship for the social sciences. And I got 1,500 New Zealand dollars, which, 25 something, 20, a long time ago, was a decent amount of money, but all it did was pay for my flight to Singapore and return. The rest of the research came out of my own funding. We have to engage privately in order to get funding sometimes to help us be able to continue our research. Now, I worked with a particular organization at the time whose interest was in Asia Pacific research, and they were giving money, not much of it, as you can see, but they were giving money to emerging researchers who were trying to tackle creating a better understanding of regional problems. And because of that, they saw the research I was doing and said, you know what? This works for us. But that wasn't through my supervisor. That wasn't through my university or my university department. That was a private approach. And as an emerging researcher, I had to take it upon myself to do that. We might want to engage with our stakeholders in terms of assessing applications. So if we're trying to go for funding, or whether we're trying to go for scholarships, etc., or we're simply trying to make sure our research is robust enough, it may also look at engagement of a variety of stakeholders. Yes, we engage to communicate findings. We'll talk about that soon. And we engage to move the results into practice. And that means when we've done our research, to implement our findings and our ideas and our suggestions, to implement that for others, or to have others implement that, is very important. We have to think about the level and timing of engagement. And to me, this is both, it's ongoing, it's iterative. We continue to identify and re-identify, engage people or involve people at different times and for different purposes. And we can have a look at whether this becomes ad hoc or whether this becomes formal. So ad hoc is, look, I'm going to need your help at a few stages or a few timings during this. I'll bring you in. Or formal, that we look at a longer term relationship. So each stakeholder or each stakeholder's relationship to us and to our research, each stakeholder's relationship to us and to our research will, of course, and will naturally be different. We can't treat two similar stakeholders in the same way, because we have to look at what their needs are as much as what our needs are from this. Now, there are 3 stages of engagement during our research, and it simply comes down to project development. So are we spending more time working with our stakeholders as we're trying to develop and strategize how we want to undertake this research? So that kind of brings us into typical action research, where we might engage with them to help us design and develop our research strategy. It can be during project duration, which is about engaging with stakeholders to help enhance our data collection. So it can be during that process. Or it can be the concept of knowledge transfer. So project completion. Oh, look, I found some things. Let me share how this will improve your life. And I know that sounds so bad, but it is what it is. And we can engage with our stakeholders at all 3 of these stages, or we can engage with them 1 or 2 only. And likewise, we might, during project development, have a very formal relationship, but during project duration and research collection, it might be very ad hoc, because we've already structured what we want. We've taken the advice, we've worked through, we've got the introductions, we've got everything. During that process, they might not contribute a lot, and we might not have a lot that we can feed back to them. But upon completion, the knowledge transfer, it becomes formal again, because we then execute some obligations about making sure that, we've shared everything that we've researched, and we've done it in a way that's relevant to them. The methods of engagement are, to me, the most important. And how you engage depends on your purpose, your knowledge transfer goals, and the strengths of your stakeholders. Why, or what I want for us tonight to get out of this particular point is we need to be somewhat more creative. I want to say liberal, but let's just say creative with the methods of engagement that we use. And much of this kind of implies I'm talking about knowledge transfer, but I'm actually talking about all. We can focus on dissemination focused methods. So this is output, and that becomes information sessions and briefings, the use of websites. And, as a researcher, and let me ask you, to think about a question. As a researcher, do you have your own website, for example, or a blog where you share updates and ideas and thoughts from your research? Some people do, some people don't. I personally believe that that's actually a very valuable tool for early career academics, for emerging researchers to use to make sure that there is a place of visibility where you can put across some of the experience, and it can be output based, it can be process based. So it's not necessarily you writing special things for your website, but it might be photographs associated with field work or things like that that help you, or commentaries on different publications that you've read. All of that is an engagement tool. And I think we have to, as emerging researchers, we have to take advantage of everything we've got. Newsletters. Now, that one's a different one, but our university departments often have a monthly or maybe a semester by semester newsletter, and ensuring that a very simple progress update for our research is included into that actually has value for us. Posters. I think a few weeks ago I did a webinar on poster presentations at conferences, and this gives us a great way of presenting research. But we have to think beyond the conference. Poster presentations at conferences is one thing. Poster presentations within our university, within our faculty office, anywhere that we have possibilities, international forums that may not quite be a conference, are actually valuable. And a final one, it's not final as in that's the only lot on the list, it's the ones I chose, is the media. And we should be asking ourselves, do I know in my city or in my country, but let's just go with in my city, do I know which media, publications, and or journalists are interested in writing about the areas or the topics that my research is on? Which media talk about a particular theme? And do I know how to get hold of them? So I am a very strong advocate for making sure that as emerging researchers, we connect to journalists who are interested in our topic, of our broader topic, so that when they need a quote, when they need a little bit of expert opinion, they will come to us and we can give them a quote or we can help them out. That gives us visibility. And as emerging academics, we, of course, need that visibility for our future, for our careers. So thinking about how can we get to know and work with different media personnel, so publications, journalists, is actually very helpful. Now, that's kind of dissemination based. or dissemination focus. That's us telling everybody. So a little bit colonial in a way where it's like, we're giving you something, that's it. A more interactive, or as I've called it, dialogue encouraging methods, but more interactive, is our use of social media as a way to share research. Whether that be LinkedIn, whether that be TikTok, whether it be Facebook, whether it be any of the plethora of other social media channels out there. Um, you know, are we using that? And we should be looking and saying, can I use this to connect my research with stakeholders of interest? Are we doing workshops and webinars? Let me ask you a question, and you don't have to answer me in any way, but I want you to think about it. When was the last time you gave a guest lecture, a guest tutorial, or a workshop or webinar on your topic? And beyond that, because most of us will say, oh, I haven't done that, which is fair because maybe we haven't. My next question is, have you ever asked if you could? So, for example, have you gone to your head of department and said, can I run a session for master's students talking about the methodology I'm using? Or can I do a short podcast for the department on my research update? Yes, it creates more work for you, but it also, one, it helps your visibility so much. But two, it gives you fantastic practice in sharing about your research to stakeholders or to communities of interest. Have you done, or are you involved in focus groups, working parties, different researchers coming together? Do you engage with or sit on advisory boards? So that's something that I do a lot. I sit on a number of advisory boards, not only for universities here in Malaysia, but for organizations, for global organizations overseas. And our job is to talk about what we see, talk about what research we're doing, and showcase how that could have meaning for different organizations. Stakeholder engagement is critical in knowledge transfer because engagement is about developing a relationship of trust. And for me to want to implement any suggestion, any thoughts that you have, there has to be a trust. You've got to be credible. You might argue, well, I'm a PhD candidate at this university, therefore I'm credible. But the truth is, trust is a personal relationship between you and a different party. And you have to build up that relationship with them. So spending time talking with them, spending time engaging with different stakeholders at different stages of your research process and your research experience actually helps build up that trust. And I want to go a step further. The more you ask for advice, the more you actually build up trust. It's not a weakness asking for advice to learn how to do something. It's a weakness not asking. It's a strength to ask and say, look, I'm trying to think through this. I've thought about it this way. How would you go about it? Receiving that advice and then going about it actually does build a lot of credibility and strengthens trust. It's understanding the user environment, the context. So who is the end recipient? And knowing better about what their needs are through your communication of research and through your engagement with them. And ultimately providing and delivering useful and usable findings. There's so much we can get from our research that we undertake. But at the end of the day, out of that so much, if it's not going to be useful for somebody else, other than useful for us defending our thesis and so forth, if it's not going to be useful outside of that, then we've lost a very big opportunity. So let me go into a couple of slides, or actually 3 slides, sorry, on best practice advice. The first one is make it relevant. So does your area of research affect people in their everyday lives? Now I'm going to sort of broaden that. Does it affect communities in their everyday practice? And if it does, that's really great, because that's where you want to focus on, especially if you're going for a broader stakeholder relationship rather than a sort of a narrow one. Now, why should people think and care about the work you do? Not because, well, I'm a PhD candidate and I did some great research, but at the end of the day, your research is about helping, or we hope your research transforms into being about helping. So from that side, we want to make, we want communities to understand there's value for them in the work that you're doing. Best practice advice number 2, tailor your message. Every audience is unique. Just like the audience that is here tonight, the 32 people in the room with me tonight, are unique compared to the same audience that I had last week. Some of you were in the room last week, but some of you weren't. Some of you are new today. Different audiences as a whole have a different set of needs. So I like this. I like this quote from Dr. Isat Das from University of Leeds. My engagement with stakeholders has always been both reactive and proactive. It is important to respond to those who reach out to you, yet also don't shy away from making new contacts in order to share your work. People will contact us, but we also have to be proactive in doing that. At the end of the day, though, those who contact us have different needs from those we reach out to, and we've got to do our absolute utmost to understand what are the needs for each respective party. I want to move on quickly to think about formats for communicating research to stakeholders. Different groups of stakeholders respond to different channels. So just sort of a few quotes that I've borrowed. When working with parliamentarians, email, phone, and attending formal events related to the research subject are helpful, but community grassroots activists are perhaps more easily approached by attending and participating in local informal events. Now, that's one way to look at it. At the end of the day, we've got to know where we will find our stakeholders, and we've got to know what is the best way to communicate with them. Is it something that we do when we're at events? Is it something that we do through social media? Do we have a more formal approach to this? Or do we engage with others? So, for example, quite often when I want to be able to communicate with stakeholders, rather than direct, I actually look at who do I know who knows my work? Who do I know that knows these people or is connected to the stakeholders of interest to me? And can I get them to broker an introduction to make that happen? So that in itself becomes a different channel. It's not about I'm sending you an email and I'm waiting for you to reply, because we all know sometimes we send emails and we never get a reply. We've got to be creative about how we go about that. We have to think about formats that are most or least effective for communicating research to stakeholders. So knowing your audience is crucial. For example, I enjoy speaking at events to promote my work, but I'm always aware that I need to tailor my style to better engage. And this has been effective for me. Again, it's coming from the same person that I quoted just before. But it's also understanding Just because you enjoy presenting at conferences doesn't mean that the stakeholders that are most relevant to you are going to enjoy listening or even be involved in said conferences. So when we look at actually engaging with stakeholders, we have to look at the power play or the power differential between ourselves as researchers and them as stakeholders. And I'm going to say in 99% of the cases, you as the researcher have to adapt to them, not the other way around. So you've got to look at what are the best channels, what are the best places, what is the best communication style, and you've got to approach it and deliver on that approach to suit them. And the most challenging aspect of engagement with stakeholders is always going to be time. So it's very difficult sometimes to be able to share your research because of different people's schedules. So having flexibility with this is important, but also finding different ways that you can engage and respect their time. So, for example, often when I talk about conducting personal interviews, I talk about the fact that you want to be somewhat limited in the questions you want or the questions that you ask. And you do this because perhaps you know that the person only has 30 minutes. And if they only have 30 minutes, what value do you want them to add to you in that 30 minutes? Asking their gender, asking their job title, asking how many years they've been working or whatever. You can get that through other means. So we want to hone in on really respecting stakeholders' time for any engagement that they contribute. When you fluff around, you kind of disrespect that, and it makes it difficult to ensure that you get time again from those individuals. So it becomes, important for us to think about it. So as we're engaging with stakeholders, setting parameters, letting them know what you need from them, how you need, and making sure that what you're asking from them is a unique value add. And also what you're giving to them is a unique value add as well. Because otherwise, time's being wasted, either theirs or yours. Let's just do, this one. Best practice advice 3, start small. So think carefully about your choice of stakeholders, how to best approach them. It's better to work with smaller organizations that are keen and able to, or agile enough to integrate your research quickly, rather than go for big hitters who may not have that interest or agility. When you get it right, the rest will follow in this sense. At the end of the day, if you've got 1,000 stakeholders, you've also only got 3 years to complete your PhD. You've got to be able to prioritize which stakeholders do you want to spend time with, which stakeholders are going to benefit the most, which stakeholders are going to contribute the most to what you're doing. And maybe, especially for those who are further down the list, maybe not the top 4 priority ones, what are the other ways I can go about communicating with them? Because not everything requires them spending face-to-face time with you. Sometimes an infographic is all that is needed, but it gives enough that they can appreciate where you're at, or they can come back and say, look, can you spend a bit more time with us? Or they can give you feedback on that aspect as well. Now I'm going to go into research communication on a deeper level. So I want to sort of focus a bit more on understanding the tools and the strategy associated with research communication. So here we have, look, how can research communication be conceptualized? And everything I've talked about up until now has been about the need for and the processes involved in working or engaging with stakeholders, whether it be one way or two ways, whether it be, transformative or whether it be informational, right? In this case, I'm looking at, look, how do we conceptualize the type of communication, not the engagement itself? The engagement is one thing. Now I'm looking at how do I actually take that research output in whatever form I choose to do it, whether it be a journal article, whether it be leading a town hall discussion. But how do I conceptualize this? And I think conceptualization of the communication mechanism, the output style, I guess to say, is actually just as important as the output and the dissemination of it. There's no point, say, for example, I'm doing some research that focuses on teenage understanding of new social media, which is great. And I write a lovely research paper. Presenting that research paper at a high school or to a group of high school teachers is not going to work. We have to conceptualize, how do I want it to be? And how is it going to work for them? How does it happen? Now, the conceptualization here comes into our thinking as researchers, because not only do we have to focus on our dissertation, but we have to focus on whatever data we collect is going to have multiple output forms. One of those forms will be a dissertation. One of those forms might be a conference. One of those forms might be an infographic or a poster. One of those forms might be a workshop with teenagers. Four very different, very, very different output forms or output styles. So our conceptualization of what we need to communicate will help us in thinking through the data that we collect, because collecting data means we have to present data, and we've got to think about it in that way. So our conceptual challenge becomes, how are we thinking about research communication and its use? And for us to create impact, and impact needs us to view our research communication in four ways. It's integral to rather than separate from the research. And what I mean by that is, look, I don't go plan my research, collect my data, write my dissertation, then say, how do I convert this into a hands-on workshop for teenagers? Because my data and the way of expressing it to others may not correlate well. Knowing what my end users or end uses are going to be is actually going to help me conceptualize. It should involve indirect rather than direct connection. So our direct connection is actually the dissertation. We know we're doing a piece of academic writing. Indirectly, we have to understand who is the other users of our research. Who are the other, let's say, benefactors of our research, stakeholders? So knowing that we will have a number of indirect parties, stakeholders interested in how we go about things is really going to help us plan and conceptualize better. It is always about engagement and learning. The PhD is about our engagement and our learning. But the real engagement and the real learning comes through the communities of interest that benefit or gain something, gain knowledge from what our research outputs are. And finally, for impact, we have to be concerned with the various ways of using research. And to be able to conceptualize, we have to understand what will our research be used for. When we write a dissertation, we're following, a very typical process, a scientific method, a typical 5-chapter study. We're using principles of academic writing. It sort of has almost a mundane element to it because there's a pattern. But when we really disseminate research beyond those who are examining us, when we disseminate research to other stakeholders, we have to understand how they're going to use it. And knowing that helps us plan how do we conduct it. So earlier on, as we identify who our stakeholders are, what type of research output we should be looking at, or what will our stakeholders appreciate from us, then we can think through those issues in certainly much more intelligent ways. Supporting different kinds of research use. Now, this comes down to, at the end of the day, what are different end users actually using our research for? And instrumental research use comes down to, it implies a concrete application of research where the research has often been translated into a material or usable form and is used to direct specific decisions and or interventions. So instrumental research use is actually a formalized, functional value add to a community of interest that they're going to adapt what we do and change their policy, their processes, their behaviors to make it happen. Now, this instrumental is the type of research use, especially we get in clinical research or closer to home, educational research, all relates back to that. Conceptual is where research may change one's thinking, but not necessarily one's actions. So in this kind of research utilization, research informs and enlightens the decision maker to think through how they might want to adapt, adopt, change, or in some respect, ignore. Conceptual is the key word. They look at the bigger picture and say, you know what, there's some things here I like, and we can work with that. Now, the third one, and I'm going to share with you an article shortly. The third one, the article that I want to share with you actually brings number 3 and number 4 together. And that's why I chose to put number 4 symbolic in brackets. But as I talk about strategic, I'm also talking about symbolic for a moment. So strategic or symbolic research use. And then I'll explain why I've broken it up. Involves the use of research as a persuasive or political tool to legitimate a position or a practice. And this is about making your research or the end use of your research impact change as a lobbying tool. Now, that to me is strategic. That makes a lot of sense. I'm not comfortable with it being symbolic, other than the fact that often we just put something there because we have to have a different point of view. I kept symbolic separate in this particular slide because for some of us, at the end of the day, the research, we know the research is not going to impact or effect change. We recognize that our research confirms something or our research shows us an alternative, but our purpose is not agenda driven other than our own doctorate and graduating. And in that case, symbolic research is research because the research can be done, but not because it needed to be done. So that's why I like to separate those two out, because I feel it is important in that respect to sort of differentiate them a little bit. Now, I mentioned a publication, and I'm just sort of putting it up if you can see on my screen, and I'm going to share this publication. It's called Communicating Research Findings. It's actually a chapter of a book that was produced in 2016, but I have the draft, which I'm happy to share. I'm going to be putting that through our WhatsApp group, excuse me, our WhatsApp group a little later tonight, and I'll try and share the link on the link on LinkedIn and our other social medias tomorrow as well, so you can download it. But if you're part of our WhatsApp chat group, I'll certainly be sharing that. It's a really good functional chapter on why and how we go about communicating research findings. What effect? Oops, sorry, my bad. Sorry, give me a second. What effective research communication involves? Now, I've talked about some of this already tonight, and it kind of comes across as common sense, but it's really here as a reminder. It is knowing your audiences. It's knowing the fact that each of the audiences of interest to you are going to have different needs. It's about identifying the key messages. And this is kind of parallels when we take our dissertation and we try to get 2 or 3 publications out of our dissertation. We don't turn a 100,000 word PhD dissertation into a 5,000 word journal article. We have to look at the key message. We have to look at one focal point that is of extreme relevance to us, and that becomes the center. There's a different purpose. It may use the same data. It may use many of the same ideas, but we're limiting or restricting or reshaping the message itself. It's about tailoring the output. So again, what I said with stakeholders, we need to go to the stakeholders, not just give it in our way and hope they adapt. We need to adjust our communication style or our outputs in this case to meet the stakeholders so that they're benefiting from our key message. And we get that because we understand who the audience is, how they need information, and how they can understand best the information we want to share. It's also about supporting uptake and use. So once you've disseminated, you've communicated something of importance, something of value, it's actually supporting them in the process of adopting or adapting to what you're suggesting. So if you're, say, working with a particular community group, for lack of a better example, you're working with a particular community group, you've got some research findings, and you've shared with them what they can do with that. It's also about your longer term obligation to advise or be an advisor to them, to help them implement the results of your research. You don't just present something and bugger off. You actually have to have a more long-term relationship and set of communication. So I might summarize something. I might do a workshop with some people, with an organization, for example. I might do a workshop with some organization, which will help them think through problems and help them make some decisions as an organization. But subsequent to that, I don't just disappear and have no understanding. I need to keep contact. I need to have some longer term relationship that offers support to them as they're adapting the research that I've done, if they're adapting the implications of the research that I'm done. So, effective research communication is not just knowing what's good from our research, presenting it to somebody or to stakeholders, but it's also about making sure that as they're working with it, you're available to help them or to at least advise them with that process as well. There is a typology of research users, and I wanted to share this because if I go back earlier in the evening, I talked about the type of stakeholders that we have, and I talked about, university supervisor examiners, the institutional ones versus everything else. I wanted to go a little bit deeper in terms of this because I wanted to showcase where it comes in. We look at business and corporate sector. We talk about government and policy, public policy making. We have civil society in the third sector. So this is NGOs, interest groups, think tanks. We have the media, we have the public. All different types of users requires from us different sets of communication approaches. And it kind of depends on whether you're going with the left or the right on this, okay? So the earlier one from Brewer on the right broke it into 3. The later one, Basto et al., broke it into 4. Culture, the state, and the market. What's important for us is to understand what our stakeholders are, who our research users are, and then most importantly, how do they need to see our research, and understanding how will they use our research. And we've also got to recognize that not every stakeholder will use our research in the way we intended it. Some will use it to prove or disprove a point, which may be different from our original purpose. Some will use it to lobby against something else, to try and change or to simply just offer a different opinion rather than a balanced opinion. So there's always going to be different agendas from the research users or the end stakeholders that engage with our research. We should, as we're looking at how do we communicate our research with them, whether it's partway through our journey, whether it's at the end of the journey, but we should be able to not only understand who they are and what they need, we should also find ways of anticipating how do we expect or how do we believe they will use our research in that respect. And this is, again, understanding their needs and their interests. It's interests they have that the research could support, whether that be in alignment with what we intended or not. Because at the end of the day, if they were interested in exactly as we were doing it, they probably would have done it themselves. So there's something that they need from it. It's the activities they undertake that the research could inform. So how are we progressing, or how are they weaponizing our research to derail something else? And we have to think about that as a possibility as well. Concerns they have that the research could address. So what is troubling them? And that's kind of your typical stakeholder interest in anything, is something's troubling them and they don't know how to solve it. And we become a solution. The communication preferences that they have that need considering, and this really comes down to the format, the output style we use. Now, again, going back to earlier on in tonight's session, if we don't conceptualize how others are going to engage with our research, if we don't conceptualize the way in which we need to work with different parties, with different stakeholders, it's going to be very hard towards the end of our research process to adapt everything we have to suit them if we don't have that mindset, because our data may not enable that. Sometimes if we know that we're going to do, community town halls, we recognize that in our data collection phase, not only do we want deep data, but we want a way of summarizing it in a more simplistic and easily visualized way that they can understand. Showing tables of statistical analysis is not going to work with your average community group, but showing a couple of pie charts may work very well. And finally, the timescales and the schedules they have that need remembering. So that was talking, like before, about respecting our stakeholders' time, but it also comes to time scales. It is about understanding when we need research, and is our solution something they need today? Is it something they needed yesterday? Or is it something they can wait a few years for? And sometimes that's not going to align. But it doesn't mean we cannot share with them work in progress. It doesn't mean that we cannot get input from them to help us through just stakeholder outreach programs. And it doesn't mean we still don't share with them the findings and make that available or offer to do further things with them, because it still may have or still will have relevance to them in the long run. Now, I'm going to wrap up for a Q&A session. So I'll hand over to Farrell in a second.